Good evening, everyone. I am Sharon Bridges, National Bar Association Women Lawyers Division Chair, and welcome to tonight's International Women's Day program, Breaking the Bias, Views from the Front Lines. Before we get started with the program, I wanted to just share a little bit about who we are at the Women Lawyers Division of the National Bar Association. We are one of the oldest subparts of the National Bar Association, founded in 1972. We will celebrate 50 years as a division at our annual convention in Memphis, July 24th through July 29th. And you don't want to miss this event. We will have a whiskey and wine tasting. We will mentor middle school and high school girls. We have a service project in collaboration with Girls Inc. and Dress for Success. We have a forum on the state of the Black woman lawyer in America. You don't want to miss that on Monday, July 25th. Our annual awards breakfast will be on Tuesday, July 26th. It's the 50th anniversary honors and achievement awards breakfast. We will celebrate and recognize women lawyers and judges from all over the country. We had over 90 nominations in 8 categories, and the winners will be announced during that breakfast. We also will recognize organizations, women and men, who have made an impact during our 50-year history. You don't want to miss this event, so please join us at the National Bar Association's annual convention in Memphis, Tennessee. Before I turn it over to the International Committee co-chairs, Valencia Rainey and Stephanie Burgess, who are our co-hosts for this evening, I want to leave you with this thought. It is a quote from one of the greatest authors, Toni Morrison. I tell my students, when you get these jobs that you have been so brilliantly trained for, just remember that your real job is that if you are free, you need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. This is not just a grab bag candy game. Toni Morrison. At this time, please meet Valencia Rainey and Stephanie Burgess, co-chairs of the National Bar Association Women Lawyers Division International Committee.
Good evening. Welcome to the Women Lawyers Division International Committee's 2022 International Women's Day celebration. WLD's International Committee was established in 2019 under the leadership and vision of past WLD Chair Valencia Rainey and current co-chair of the International Committee. In 2019, we were proud to boast MOU and collaboration with Ghana Women Lawyers Division. And we are proud to boast that in 2021, our primary focus for that MOU came to fruition, wherein they were formally recognized as a part of Ghana's Bar Association. In 2021, we were really busy. In March of 2021, we celebrated and participated in International Women's Day for the very first time. And we collaborated with African lawyer sisters from about 8 other countries. Then in April of 2021, we moderated, Valencia Rainey and we moderated the International Summit. Then in June of 2021, we participated in an international networking tea party. And now we are so proud for what's coming up next. So yes, International Committee for the WLD's International Committee has been up to big things with more big things to come. As our chair, Sharon Bridges just stated, there will be an international wine and whiskey tasting on July 22nd from 5 to 8 in Memphis, Tennessee. And we are excited, and the tickets are on sale for $40 as I turn it over to my co-chair and the vision of the International Committee, Valencia Rainey. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Madam Chair. Greetings. I'm Valencia Rainey. I'm the immediate past chair of the Women Lawyers Division and the co-chair, along with Stephanie Burgess, of the International Committee. We thank you for joining us tonight as we celebrate International Women's Day. that day that's set aside to acknowledge and celebrate women all over the globe. This year's International Day theme, Break the Bias. We're really excited to celebrate this with this phenomenal panel here tonight. International Women's Day is a global celebration of social, economic, cultural, and political achievements of women all over the world. It's a call to action. It's a call to accelerate parity for women, and it's a call to action where groups come together and rally for women's equality. This event is celebrated every year on March 8th, all around the globe. Organizations come together to celebrate women's achievement, raise awareness about women's equality, and lobby again for accelerated gender parity, which we really need. International Women's Day invites us to imagine a world free of bias, stereotypes, and discrimination, a world that's diverse, equitable, and inclusive, a world where differences are valued and they're celebrated. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our two esteemed moderators for this evening and to thank my co-chair, Stephanie Burgess, for visioning and creating our first annual International Women's Day celebration just last year. Our moderators for this evening. First, we have Dr. Stephanie Barnes, Esquire. Dr. Stephanie Barnes is a healthcare transactional attorney who speaks and writes on leadership, gender, equality, and women's rights. Secondly, we have attorney Tamika Hardy. Tamika is a partner at Rifkin Rattler, LLP. She counsels and represents employers in a wide range of employment law matters. She's a member of Women Lawyers Division and the Labor and Employment section, as well as the immediate past president of the NBA local affiliate, Amistad Long Island Black Bar Association in Long Island, New York. With that, our moderators will now introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It is certainly a great day to be a woman. Every day is a great day to be a woman. But of course, today we are celebrating women across the globe. But this is sort of a dim on our celebration because we have yet to achieve gender equality. And as you know, the theme for this year is Break the Bias. Why is this so important and what exactly are we working towards? I want to share some quick stats with you that sets our discussion today in perspective and why it is so important for us to break the bias. The World Economic Forum produces an annual report that shares the global gender gap across the world. And here's something I want you to think about. In 2020, the report that was published in 2021 showed that it would take 99.5 years to achieve to close the gap globally, to close the gender gap globally. Now, just 1 year later, the 2021 report that was just published shares that it will take 135.6 years. Y'all, we are losing ground. So not only is the gender gap not closed, it is widening. That's why it is so important now, more than ever, for us to be deliberate about closing the gender gap. So how do we break this bias? Well, not just talking about it. Certainly we will hear some great ideas today, but it's taking the action. It's through these courageous conversations that result in even more courageous actions that will lead us to be able to break the bias. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleague to introduce our panelists, and we can get these courageous conversations going. Tamika?
Thank you, Stephanie. So tonight we have some outstanding panelists. We have Erica Edwards O'Neill. She is a strategic diversity, equity, and belonging professional, trainer, and consultant and lawyer. She currently holds the role of Senior Vice President of DEIS at New York Roadrunners. We have Deborah Martin Owens. She is the East Coast Diversity Director at Sidley Austin LLP, where she develops and implements programs, policies, and initiatives that support Sidley's strategic diversity and inclusion goals in its Boston, New York, and Washington, D.C. offices. We have Crystal Studevant Ramsey. She serves as Blank Rome's Director of Diversity and Inclusion, managing the firm's diversity and inclusion functions and strategies firm-wide across the firm's 14 offices and over 1,000 employees. We have Kim Hulsey, and she leads all internal and external DEI activities for an AM 100 firm, Locke and Lord LLP, including client engagement, diverse attorney recruitment and retention, DEI training, affinity group oversight, and diversity metrics. Kim came to this role after several in-house roles in the media industry and a period of legal search consultant. And we have Dana Peterson Moore, who serves as the City of Baltimore's first ever Chief Equity Officer and Director of the city's Office of Equity and Civil Rights. I am now going to turn back to my co-moderator, Stephanie, so that we could start with our first discussion topic. Thank you.
All right, so I hope that you are ready to hear from these women and hear all of their experiences so that we can begin to break the bias. So before we break the bias, we need to understand what is a bias. Now I'm going to share kind of a academic definition or academic perspective on it, and then we'll hear from some of our panelists as to what this really means when bias shows up in the workplace. So again, let's share a little data. So 42% of women experience gender discrimination at work. And gender bias, by the way, is the tendency basically to prefer one gender over another. 5 out of the 14 top barriers that women face in the workplace are related to discrimination and gender bias. Women are 79 more times likely to be hired when there are at least 2 female candidates in the finalist pool. And that is something that is another reason why it's so important to break the bias. The more there are of us, the more of us there can come forward. Women and men ask for pay raises at the same rate, but women receive pay raises 5% less often. Why is this happening? Sometimes, of course, it is this overt bias, but sometimes it is also unconscious gender bias. And this is when it is an unintentional, and automatic mental associations that are based on gender norms, stemming from traditions, conditionings, cultural experiences, and so forth. This is when we have decided that women are this kind of leader and men are this kind of leader, and make the preference for men just based on how we've been socialized. So what we want to explore is, how does this really show up in the workplace? Now, we're going to launch our first poll because we do want this to be interactive. We want to hear from you. So while the poll is launching, I want to share with you that you will have an opportunity after each segment to post your questions in the chat, because we do want to hear from you and give our panelists an opportunity to share with you based on the questions that you present. So here's our first panel. And if you have a few seconds rather, to answer the question, but let us know what types of biases you have experienced the most. And of course, our hosts and panelists, we can't participate. This is only for our audience. All right, we can go ahead and close that out and see what experiences our poll has. And we see that many of us, as we expected, are experiencing either all of these or at least more than just gender. Of course, we know that even though today is International Women's Day, there's more than gender bias at play. So we're going to hear from our first panelist, Crystal. If you will share what you've seen in the workplace, how you've seen bias show up in the workplace, and what have been some of your experiences.
Sure. First, I just want to say thank you to Sharon Bridges and to Valencia, to Stephanie, both of the Stephanies in their beautiful yellow today, and all of the MBA WLD for having us here today. This is a great panel, and I know it's going to be a rich conversation. The way that I've seen, gender bias show up is it's often baked into the systems within our workplaces and also into the culture, right, into the corporate culture. And that plays out in a variety of ways. I've seen it play out when it comes to promotion and advancement. Preventing women from advancing at certain levels comparative to men. In the legal industry, definitely when it comes to work allocation and to credit and recognizing the contributions that, are being made by women. I've seen it play out when it comes to mentorship and sponsorship, and us not being able to, be able to have the types of mentors and sponsors that men have. And another way that I've seen it play out is when it comes to social networking, men making the assumptions that I'm not going to want to go to a basketball game or a baseball game or anything along those lines when it comes to networking. So I'm left out of those types of circles. So those are some of the ways that I've seen it play out.
Okay. All right, Kim, what are some of the ways that you've seen bias show up in the workplace?
I would echo all that. Well, first of all, good afternoon, good evening. It's good to be here with everybody. I'm very excited to be a part of this rich conversation and feel honored to have been asked and to be in the room. I would share the sentiments that Crystal has expressed. I would also say that sometimes it comes in far more subtle form. For example, in a meeting that may be more men in the room, we find that the dynamics of the conversation are such that men can be comfortable talking, across each other, cutting each other off, interrupting one another. Women's communication style is different. One isn't better or worse, but in an environment that is male-driven and male-led, the kind of communication styles that women sometimes express, or maybe even our emphasis on consensus versus one versus the other, or a zero-sum game, is often not prized in the workplace. When we talk about, and I think that Crystal hit it on the head, but when we talk about those social settings, when there are retreats and when there are special off-site events, are the conversations about business development around golf, are they at these sports events, or are they held at the spa? Or are we choosing things that might be a little bit more gender balanced? Are we going bowling or some other kinds of events? So are we making sure that we're checking out the social events that we're involved in? The other piece or other place that I really see that it can come up a lot is in feedback. Cross-cultural and cross-gender feedback can be very, very challenging. And so you'll find that mano a mano, for example, men to men are very comfortable identifying areas of, where a written product may need to be adjusted, or maybe some feedback on the way that an associate is interfacing with a client. There's often some hesitancy when it comes to giving observations to women when it's coming from a man. And so as a consequence, nothing is said. And so, when you look at the trajectory, who's going to grow more? The person's going to grow more if they are given meaningful feedback. If they're given none, then over time, they're not given enough information to improve, to grow, and to change. So those would be three other examples or extensions of what Crystal has explained that I think where gender bias shows up in the workplace.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to hear from Deborah. What are some of the ways that you've seen gender bias show up in the workplace?
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Barnes. I want to thank everyone for inviting me here. I'm so happy to see old friends like Crystal and Erica, and new friends like Kim and Dana. And of course, I want to say I'm so happy to be back home with the National Bar Association. As you know, I have been a long time supporter, member, involved. And it just warms my heart that NBA has invited me to speak as opposed to working all day. So I'm just happy. And I also want to commemorate, we'll be 100 years in less than 2 years. And I want to say, I hope to see more of this kind of programming. I think both Kimberly and Crystal hit it on the head. There is all of these aspects in mentorship and sponsorship, in feedback, in work allocation, you name it. I'll give an example. Just even in the last couple of days, I've had to work with our associates at the firm to focus on their performance reviews, and just even having to look at all the performance reviews of how we sort of massage and characterize the work as it pertains to working with male partners and what we have to do for our women partners. Our associates are keenly focused on how they are viewed by their male partners if they're a woman, and how they're viewed if they are viewed as male partners if they are a male. And so for me, it's been very difficult when I look at some of these aspects to see that we have an associate who has not worked with any women, right? And she is a woman. That is a very difficult conversation as to where if it's a man and he's worked with all men. And so for me, I have been keenly aware, because I've always been very focused as a Black woman, that it's more of my race than anything else. But I feel for this kind of work that there are some real work to do in this gender bias conversation, because for me, grew up in a different type of world where it's just my race, and that's what I have to contend with. But in this generation, it is both. And that's why I think the poll has led us to believe that, for me, if you're talking 5 years ago, I would have said race, race, race. But it's also a conversation around gender. So I've seen it all in terms of what we have to do in this work to challenge ourselves as it relates to gender bias.
Okay. And as we wrap up this segment, we do have one question about strategies. And so, we've heard about how, or some of the ways that biases have shown up, or how you've seen it. Would one of you like to comment on some of the strategies that you have implemented or would recommend to counter some of the biases that you've seen?
I would love to say that when I've had conversations with our stakeholders about a woman associate or even a woman partner, and it's everyone in the room is a male, I question the voices in the room. Mm-hmm. I will say, I think this is all great, but do you notice that I'm the only woman in this room that's having this conversation about this other woman that's not in the room? How can we get more women in the room to have a conversation about this particular attorney? And so it has been a real focus to think about lateral hiring of women partners, a real focus on lateral hiring of our women associates. For me, it's if we don't have those voices at the table, then what are we saying? What are we doing?
Right. And as our chair shared, coming out with her introductory remarks from Toni Morrison, we have to be a part of that conversation. And when we are in the room, let our voices be heard. Thank you so much for sharing that strategy. And of course, we will have a chance to capture some more strategies as we go throughout, but I'm going to turn it over to Tamika to key up our next segment.
Thank you, Stephanie. So our next segment is about the informal pipelines and the inherent biases that clog them. And some of our panelists have already touched on this a little bit. And, when we were putting together this panel and discussing some of the issues, it brought back to me a presentation that I went to a few years ago, right after the explosion of the Me Too movement. And I remember watching a male panelist explain how he no longer goes to lunch with his female junior reports or underlings, that he no longer puts himself in a situation where he's alone in an office with them, or where there might be any possible appearance that he's a part of any type of Me Too type of issue. And I thought to myself, well, that's not great for the females at his company, because we know that when you have that type of pipeline clog, it's going to affect your project assignments, and the panelists have alluded to this, participation in leadership development programs. It's going to affect your performance evaluations because they haven't been exposed to your work. The fewer interactions that you have with a senior leader in your company, this is also just going to widen that career advancement, the gaps. So now we're going to queue up our next poll question, which is, have you ever felt that you were excluded from the informal pipeline in your workplace that promotes career advancement? So we're going to give about 30 seconds or so to answer this poll, and then we can close it. Okay, I think we could close it. Thank you. So let's see the results. So we have 88% of us said yes, that we felt as though we've been excluded from this informal pipeline. So at this point in our discussion, our question to the panelists is, can we have a frank discussion about how it really works, and about the subtle yet debilitating impact of that social network that excludes women and prevents them from moving up the corporate or career chain. So I'm going to first start with Erica. Thank you.
All right. First of all, thank you, Tamika, and thank you all for having me. I'm really, really excited to be a part of the conversation, and excited to, as Deborah said, great to see old friends and meeting and connecting with new folks. That being said, I think it's a layered approach. One, we know that there are the notions of the pipelines that come from your preference for even what institution you will hire from, right? So you have the layer of, I'm only going to recruit from certain institutions, colleges, firms, only certain lateral places that will likely be heavily male, heavily white dominated spaces. So that's one layer. And then let's say a woman makes it through those layers of, is it the right institution that you've received your law degree or whatever degree from? When you're in there, then you're having all these other layers of what networks were you in? Fraternities, sororities. Are you a first generation student person, lawyer? There's so much that happens from the law school to the law firm, where I can say in law school, I remember like being one of few people who didn't have a existing outline, right? That came from people who had come from families and networks where the outlines were literally passed down to them. I didn't realize that I wasn't in the right network to have a tool, right? So then you talk about, like, that's why I say it's like really layered. But in the workplace, there are these spaces. I formerly, having worked in legal career services, had a colleague, a former law student, who was placed as a first year special diversity recruitment fellow program, and was working really, really hard, staying late. And we got a call from the law firm that said he wasn't showing up at any of the social events, right? That was cultural. There were two, there was a male and a female. Part of that challenge was they both said, listen, where we're from, we're told to get in and work hard. We didn't know that we needed to go, that turning down the golf, the bowling, the drinks would affect us, right? So there's just like this unspoken language that's not in the performance review system. It's not in the job description. It is like the secret language, right? written in invisible ink. And so it was really, I will say, shocking for the 2 law students who were saying, wait a minute, you're telling me my assignments are right, my writing is strong, and you received a call because I didn't go to the social events? Where would I have learned that, right? So those things absolutely show up, and it's really hard to talk about it without talking about the intersectionality. I don't know which one of my fellow panelists said that, the assumptions about what you would even be interested in being invited to, right? So if there were let me just pause here to say, right, there are the assumptions about who skis and who doesn't, who fishes and who doesn't, who drinks, who bowls, all these things about, like, you may have a more junior person invited to participate in something because of an assumption that you were not involved. And so I think that I certainly, having worked in pipelining for many, many years, it was the soft, unspoken language that I saw it really tripping up a number of new lawyers, new career professionals. And it does feel like an unfair grading system in that space. And so, I'll pause there and leave room for someone else to chime in.
Thank you, Erica. We're now going to hear from Dana to talk on this particular topic.
Connectivity.
Okay, so Dina, we're going to pause and we're going to come back to you, and we're going to go.
Sure. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you now. So you
Okay.
can speak to this topic.
Sure. So I'm now in public sector, and it's a little bit different, but let me just put my law firm hat back on. And what I found is that there were rules that were spoken, and then it was the unwritten rules that trip you up. And it's exactly what Erica just talked about. It's the unwritten rules that, somebody's got to tell you that they exist. Before I go into that, thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. It really is good to be back home in the National Bar Association with the Women's Law Division. I've missed you guys, I really have. So thank you for welcoming me back. I started out my career working in large law firms here in Baltimore City. My first law firm, and I'm going to talk about it tomorrow night in another session, my direct report had I don't know whether it was kindness or what, but he wanted me to know that he used to be a bigot, but he no longer was. And here I am, this young, brand new attorney, and I'm like, I don't even know what to do with that. That is really just shocking to me. I guess in hindsight, I should thank him because at least I knew what I was dealing with. But the guys would go off and play golf, and I'd watch them leave at 11 a.m. to go have these client experiences. And thank God for the National Bar Association and my big brothers in the bar who said, "Come on, Dana, let me teach you how to play golf." And Clyde and Rayfield and others were like constantly saying, you got to learn how to do this. And so eventually I started inviting myself on those golf outings. and that required me to be something that I really wasn't, which was brave and a little bit bolder than I really wanted to be. But I could see that I was being left out and it didn't feel good. So I had to push. I was the only Black woman in the law firm for a long time. So there was no sister to raise me up in the law. It's different now. There are so many unwritten rules, but we know the rules, we know. And there are a lot of people, brothers and sisters, Black and brown folks in these law firms now that know the rules, and we have a duty. I'm not there now, but there's a duty to you talk about the pipeline, to reach out and bring those younger folks in and tell them what the real deal is. I used to say, when I was on the hiring committee, you would get folks that were really stellar, had amazing resumes and accomplishments, but they weren't nice. They just weren't nice to be around. And I would never choose to hire someone like that. And so, you've got to kind of get out of your shell. You've got to reach out. You've got to, the social really matters. It's all of that plus excellence in how you handle your cases. It's client outreach, having your own relationship with clients, bringing in clients, start small, go big. You've got to have all of that. So that's the secret stuff, the secret sauce to success, I think, in a law firm.
And if I could add something, there are several of us who are leading diversity efforts in our respective organizations. And I think one of the things that's in addition to all the things that Erica and Dana mentioned is it's incumbent on us to say, hey, you know what? You chose skeet shooting. Do you think that that's going to resonate? And if not, could we consider some other things? Or, you know what, maybe skeet shooting does resonate, but why don't we poll everybody so we at least are giving our associates and our partners a sense of weighing in and having a voice and a contribution to what their experience is like. So often these decisions are made and you show up at the retreat or the annual meeting and all this stuff is already, set out for you. So we as leaders, and now that we are in these roles, I don't know that we could say that 10 years ago or 15 years ago, we have a real opportunity to impact leaders at our firm and have them think a little bit differently. They have blind spots, we have blind spots. We don't need to judge about that, but we certainly have an opportunity to inform the discussion so we can create a more welcoming environment for all involved, not just those who golf or spa or any of those other sort of more extreme things that may be a little bit less gender balanced or even racially balanced in terms of their participation than some other things.
And if I could happen, oh, go ahead, Dana.
It's all about doing something different and being unafraid to ask for what you need and to ask for what you want. I heard someone say earlier, you have not because you ask not. And I think the climate is a lot more welcoming to differences and to change. And we've been doing that work and it's different because we've been doing the work.
So we're going to hear from Crystal and then we're going to take a couple of questions.
Yeah, and I'm going to say this quickly. We've talked about talent pipelines, but I think also we have to become more intentional about building leadership pipelines. Once you're in the workplace, it's like, how do you advance? And that's something that we're focused on at Blank Rome is because often what we hear is they're not ready for leadership. They're not ready for advancement. But a lot of times that's based on a subjective view and not objective criteria that has been shared with everyone so that they know what the benchmark is and they know how to attain it. So I think it's being more transparent with that criteria, making it more objective and really building leadership, pipelines within.
Tamika, can I please add to that really, really quickly?
Go ahead.
I think I'd be remiss without saying that, like, what we just teased out was an extraordinary balance between advocacy, us reaching back and informing folks coming to the pipeline, but absolutely putting pressure on and accountability for these organizations who need to consider what their efforts are, who their efforts are benefiting or potentially burdening. There's got to be this space around. It seems I don't want too much of the conversation to be on what all our people need to do, women need to do to get, as Kimberly said, to get themselves prepared. Organizations need to pivot and understand that most organizations and systems were built and created not with most of us in mind. Moms, people over a certain age, all areas of intersectionality. And so there's a constant reminder to say, shift, right? Shift from not to have a historical hangover, but to say, let's re-ideate with diversity and equity in mind. And I just wanted to add that to the rich conversation.
Thank you. So we have some questions. So one of the first questions that came up is looking at it from a different perspective, because we talked about what you're doing in your respective roles in your organizations. And we talked about getting the organizations themselves to reframe the way they're handling things. But one of the questions that someone wanted to know is, how do I go about inviting myself to the golf outing or to the event? They said, I always feel awkward placing myself in situations where I'm not invited. So how do I get in there and get invited, or just put myself in that situation where I am a part of that program and in that pipeline? So that's the question.
That's a really, that's a great question. I had saw it in the chat. I think we have to be okay with asking for what we want. And so when we hear the group, you know, is right outside the proverbial water cooler or wherever it is, and they're talking about, hey, we're going to be going out Saturday morning at 7 a.m. Oh, that sounds great. I'd love to attend as well. You know, it's not a, can I attend? It's, I would love to attend as well. Where's everyone meeting, you know, and would love to go. They're not going to say, oh, no, you cannot go, because one, they don't want to be in front of us, two, an HR, and two, I think sometimes to Erica's point, yes, you know, sometimes we say, okay, what's our burden, right, to do this? But what is also leadership's burden to say, we cannot exclude these groups that we work so hard to bring into these spaces, whether if it's a nonprofit or a large law firm. They're not going to say, well, we cannot invite Erica to come and golf with us, because again, they don't want the risk issues of being in front of HR and DEI director. But I think we have to also be very proactive in sort of putting ourselves out there. And it's very uncomfortable, but once we do that, we will be welcomed, I do believe. And if we're not welcome, then we need to actually, there was something that Erica said that was so interesting, is that in addition to us trying to sort of get into their sort of network and way they socialize, we also have our own ways to socialize. And we sort of always like make that secondary, but our relationships as Black people in the large law firm space or any of the spaces of a legal profession is very large. Everyone here knows each other or knows of each other, right? And then when we start to figure out who we know, then there's another group. And so we can't really, what I say, despise our beginnings. Mm-hmm. We need to look at who we know in our network and build on that. At Sidley, we have a really good, healthy group of Black lawyers. And I said, I know, you know, there's got to be some people from the D9, you know, in here. And my colleague in the Central Region just emailed and said, are you members of any groups? And it was like more than 40% wrote back, said, yes, this is the group I'm in. That is a network. That is a network, you know? And so for me, we have to be very open to what we would like to engage with, right? But we also need to know we have our own network together as Black people.
Thank you. That was great. All of the information that you guys shared on this topic. I know we have some other questions, and we will try to get back to them during other portions of the program. But for the purposes of being able to tackle all of our topics, we're going to move to the next topic. So I'm going to throw this back to my co-moderator, Stephanie.
All right, and we do have some really great questions and some really great information that's coming out. As we segue into our next topic, I want to share a couple more stats. And that the first one is, you know, women are 25 to 46% more likely to be hired when blind applications or auditions are in place. Men are 30% more likely to obtain managerial roles. 40% of men and women notice a double standard against female candidates. Men view unconscious bias as the #1 barrier that women face in their career. So this is a perspective coming from men. So that is the stat that I wanted to segue into our next topic, and that is the fact, and we've kind of hit on this a little bit, that not all gender bias comes from men. There are some instances where gender bias is perpetuated among women. Now, I am, in addition to an attorney, also a researcher. And one of the things that I've been studying for the past few years is this syndrome called the Queen Bee syndrome. And it is actually studied where there is a phenomenon where women are in the position to put other women in leadership positions, to mentor them, or to otherwise ensure that they make their way through the leadership pipeline, but consciously decide not to, or consciously work against other women. This phenomenon, again, is called the Queen Bee Syndrome. There's lots of research on it. And the other component to this that is an issue study that is specific among women is this concept of relational aggression. And for purposes of brevity, it is basically when grown women are acting as mean girls in the workplace, bullying, using social relationships to exclude, and so forth. So I wanted to talk about something that perhaps we may not think about as being a barrier to breaking the bias, and that is when women are actively promoting bias or discriminating against other women. So we're going to launch our third poll. And as we launch that, I want to remind you that if you have questions, to put those in the chat. So yeah, there we go. The next poll is up. And while you're answering that, I'm going to invite Dana. You'll be the first up to share your thoughts on this after we close out our poll. All right.
Sure. Do you want me to go ahead?
Give me just
Okay.
one. We'll see. We can go ahead and close it out. I think everyone has had an opportunity. All right. So yes, 86% of women have encountered a queen bee in their work environment. So this is not something that is happening occasionally, but something that is a part of the problem. So Dana, we'll hear from you on your experiences with this, either from the perspective of how you have encountered it or how we can work to advocate against queen bees in the workplace.
Yeah, and so I think I've been really cursed and blessed in this regard. Blessed because I've typically been the older woman in certainly in the law firms and in the workplace, and you tend to be the director. So there haven't been too many instances in my career where there was someone senior to me. Although I guess when I first started, there were women that were superior in rank. And then I say curse because it's really not fun being the only one in a law firm or in your office. But yeah, I totally understand, the queen bee syndrome and being aware of it and guarding against it. I guess my advice would be, one, just for those of us that are in the leadership positions, to be aware of it and to be really super mindful and maybe even overcompensate so that you're not interfering with someone's advancement. Now, just speak for myself in my current role. I'm always looking for ways to create opportunities for all of my staff to advance themselves, to learn more, to get extra training, to always ask, what is it that you want to do? Where do you want to go? And then let's talk about how we get there. I mean, I had that conversation today with a colleague who really wants to do something different. She's in law school, but she knows what she wants to do, and the pathway to it is a whole lot of steps. So we talked about her opportunity training and what that path would look like. And it felt good to have that conversation. As we're in these leadership roles, I think it goes right back to the very beginning of what we talked about, which is always having your hand out to bring others along and to actively do that. I had another call this afternoon with a young woman, a law student, who's applying for a judgeship. She has her interview tomorrow, and it was, and she dropped in, I'm Dominican, and should I mention that in the interview? And we talked through how she can talk about sharing her very rich experience as a first-generation law student in her family and her Dominican background. and her bilingual skill, and how valuable that would be for a judge. And, you know, I think it's these little conversations that really show our sisters what the path to their success is, and making sure that there is not a roadblock on that path.
Right. And Crystal, we're going to come to you. And as you're coming off of mute, I just wanted to comment on one of the, share one of the comments rather in the chat from Karen, who was sharing that as a former litigator, she often had encounters with the bench that left her in tears from Black female judges. So Crystal, what has been your experience with Queen Bees? And also, of course, if you have advice and strategies on how to manage that.
Yeah, and it's somewhat similar to that comment that just came through the chat. And it's opposite, you know, to the experience Dana mentioned, because I would say throughout my career, I've had just as much, if not more, bias from women than I've had from men. And when you add on the other dimensions of me being a younger Black woman that's been in leadership roles or aspiring for leadership roles, I've experienced it at a much higher level when it comes to women, Black and otherwise. I can remember times in my career where I was up for promotion and it was majority senior level women from different backgrounds that were the ones trying to block me from advancing, because they were either saying I didn't have enough experience, I needed to pay my dues, I wasn't the right fit, and so on and so on. So the way that I have, you know, addressed that is, for one, Dana touched on it, and that is open communication, right? Sitting down, having conversations so they understand where I'm coming from and what I'm bringing to the table, the respect that I have for them and the dues that they have paid. So I think having that open channel of communication has been very helpful for me. The other thing I would say that's been very helpful for me as far as dealing with this issue outside of open communication has been the give and take approach, which you probably heard about give and take from Adam Grant, you know, the Wharton professor, which is where I'm showing I'm not here to just take your position. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to be of service to you, just like hopefully you can be of service to me, and we can help one another. So those are the approaches that I've taken.
All right. And Erica, we're going to round out with some comments from you on how perhaps you have dealt with Queen Bees in the workplace.
Well, I think I've had less of that and more of, I think, I would call like the passive aggressive. That is that notion of, I wore my hair natural for a very long time before it was, you know, acceptable. And so looking at the layers of intersectionality, women, right? But if we look at things like the implicit association test and that project through Harvard, time and time again, women choose men and associate men with leadership, with certain roles, with certain perspectives. And so I think I've seen more in that way that it is, and maybe it's been like my naivete to Queen Venus, but it is those spaces where I felt like I've had to, you know, some cases I have to work twice as hard to, one, convince another woman or a senior woman, to Crystal's point, that I respect you, I'm here to learn and grow, but also pushing. There's been like a delicate dance in that space, right? Trying to, one, create relationship, and that's not always welcome or warm. That's just like, or wanted. And so I typically look for, right, in most spaces, they have sometimes been women of color, and other times they've not been, but I've looked for people who were sponsors and mentors, right? Who was going to help mention my name in rooms that I wasn't in. And, you know, to continually, I love that notion of the give and take, continually trying to show up in those spaces. And so on that one hand, I've certainly experienced it, but when I moved into a space where I had some level of power and authority, it's a constant, almost like re-examining of your own perspectives and biases, right? Where may I be perpetuating some of the bad behavior, right? What am I, where am I making space for other women? Where am I maybe misjudging people? And I like to give examples. One example is I was on a panel that was recruiting, hiring a consulting firm to do some work around language transcription. And the only firm that did not present all suited up, all buttoned up, it was like 3 women. And immediately my first gut reaction, I didn't say it out loud, was that I was like, I would never show up in, something sort of a suit and blah, blah, blah. They opened their mouths and they were by far the best candidates. Now, what was interesting is that that panel reviewing them, we were all women, different ages, different backgrounds. And when they walked out, a colleague turned and said, how many of us will admit that we wrote them off when they walked in?
Right.
So checking, where am I using the wrong tools, right? The master's tools in spaces that are just inappropriate, and understanding also, and it's not to be caught up in this notion that this is a pie mentality. If I get a slice, you don't get a slice, or the one, if it's one end, it can't be 2 of us. And that has been real. I've certainly had exposure to that. And I think it's constantly monitoring myself and checking myself.
Right. And as we close this segment out, I wanted to kind of throw out a question about just looking at some of the comments, thinking about my own experiences that can help us help each other to be better advocates. When I was a healthcare executive, I was the only Black woman on the senior leadership team and wanted to diversify my department, but was apprehensive in how I went about doing that so that my efforts wouldn't be stalled by people looking at, oh, here's the Black woman now putting Black people, or more women into leadership positions. So when we are in these spaces where we are the woman VP, or we are the woman in charge of DEI, or we are the woman now who has the power to bring others into this space, how can we avoid kind of slipping into this queen bee syndrome type effect where we don't use that power or are imposing higher standards in order to validate our efforts and not draw ire from our colleagues? Crystal, would you like to comment on that, or either of Crystal or Dana? Erica or Dana? Crystal?
I just wanted to say real quick before Crystal or Dana jumps in, I think we also have to look at, and everyone that knows me knows, I am far more an advancer of Black women than ever be called a queen bee. Everyone knows that. But I've had some queen bee experiences. And I will tell you that as I look back at it, that was real trauma for that person to feel that they were not able to advance me because they were going to lose out. And so we really have to think about the trauma that Black women or just women in general go through at the workplace that perpetuates this kind of behavior. And so I can look back on it. Now, when I was going through it, I was in my feelings and ready to, be in the street. But when you think about it, I think about it now, there have been some painful moments in the queen bee. And I think about Crystal, who I just love and adore. That's painful to kind of grow through that as a young woman trying to get into that, proverbial C-suite or whatever it is that she's trying to do. But looking back on it, I can say those women they come from trauma, right? In the workplace where they felt like I had to do that to get to where I am, and you have to suffer that too to get to where you are going to be. And so as I look back on it, all I can do is say for those who did try to block me, I forgive you, right? We have to forgive them and we have to move forward, but understand that this behavior is not because they just wanted to come out the womb and be nasty. This is really about trauma that they've experienced and have moved forward to. So I just wanted to put that out there.
I think it's a great segue into what I'm going to say, which is that trauma, those experiences is what drives me to do just the opposite. Right now, every time a Black woman calls me, whether I have the time or not to mentor them, I'm trying my best to mentor them. When it comes to the pipeline, I'm being very intentional about, yes, adding Black women to the pipeline. When it comes to developing leaders internally, yes, I'm trying to give as many opportunities to develop the future leaders. And yes, the focus is on Black women. So I'm being very intentional because I'm driven by my own experiences, what I've observed that has happened to others, and because I am trying to, distinguish really or diminish that whole queen bee syndrome, or put that out, and using my queen bee power in a positive way.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, awesome.
So
I would concur
agree.
because I was just going to say, and I'll be really quick. I almost reject the question a little bit. I think we are, and I'm new to this feeling. I'm more than 50, so I grew up in a whole different era. But I'm tired of apologizing and kowtowing. And you know what? I am going to, address this or help this sister or do whatever. Why? Because y'all say that y'all were committed to diversity. And look at these numbers. These numbers don't reflect that. So we're going to do what needs to be done to get us where we want to be. You don't like it? Then tell me another way to get where we want to be. I don't have to apologize for that or to be small. I grew up believing that I had to be small. I am of a different mindset now. And I think that our workplaces can accept that. And if they can't, then they've hired the wrong person. Because I think that if you're intentional, I'm going to help you to be intentional. I'm going to do that unapologetically. Yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, it's different. But, we don't advance without being different. We don't get stronger unless we pick up some greater weights. We don't get faster unless we do speed work if we're running. So we're going to go through a little bit of discomfort, but we're going to do it for the benefit of what we all said was the goal of diversity. And that may mean some additional support, some additional help, some additional, uplift for certain people, because that's where they need to be, because right now the numbers still don't support any form of equity. Go ahead, Dana, I'm sorry, and thank you.
No, that was beautiful. And I totally agree. We're all doing a standing applause for that. So my background, I grew up with 6 sisters, and this whole notion called the other mother. My parents separated. We lived in a neighborhood in Washington, D.C., where there were a lot of single moms, and all the mothers looked out for everybody. And that's the culture that I grew up in. There were 7 girls and 1 boy in our blended family. And I don't know anything other than helping my sisters. I don't know a culture other than that. And that is some of the richest stuff that I do in my day, in my work, is helping younger women. I'll help anybody. It's not race specific. If you call me and you tell me you want to know how to be a lawyer, you want to know how to be a judge, you want to find your way in, you want to go to law school, you want to come in and do DEI work, I'm there for you. Now, sometime we need to talk about the other side of the queen bee, which is, folks that aren't necessarily with you. They see you as the leader, and they're knocking you down just because you're the leader. I don't know you're the researcher, Dr. Stephanie. What is that called?
Studies around that as well.
But look, you call me, so one of the things I am most proud of, and it's just a small thing, I bought 100 Maya Angelou quarters. And you can't get them now because they're sold out at the US Mint. And I keep them in my pocket. And when I encounter our sisters, I'll slide you a quarter, because I want you to keep it. Tape it to your screen, to your computer, and be inspired. Be inspired. Be inspired. Because there's good stuff happening. Sun, moon, stars have aligned. This is our time. This is our time. Look at Judge, Ketanji Brown Jackson. This is our time. It's changing. Hang on, sisters. Just hang on. Just hang on. You're not alone.
Right. Dana, I love that. I just wanted to just piggybacking off what you said, and Kimberly, is that it is okay right now in this time to be race explicit. I can be race explicit and lead with race, and it doesn't mean that I'm being exclusive. I'm just being clear that I am leading with race, and that's okay too.
And that is a great segue into our next topic. I'm going to turn it over to Tamika to launch us into our final discussion. Tamika? You ready?
Thank you, Stephanie. So I think that this is probably the topic that everyone has been waiting for. It has been alluded to. So we're talking about the intersectionality between race and gender discrimination. And so I'm going to borrow Stephanie's model a little bit and give a couple of stats here. So basically, when we're thinking about people who are in the C-suite, what we're seeing is 62% of those individuals are white males, 20% of those are white females, 13% of them are men of color, and 4% are Black women. And when we're looking at law firms, which we're all lawyers here, and we're looking at the partners at the various law firms across the country, what we're seeing is that Black and Latinx women represent less than 1% of the partners at law firms. So when we were discussing this panel, I was talking to Stephanie. I said, well, we have to have a section on the intersectionality of race and gender, because I remember being as young as in college and being at a women's center event and having one of the speakers talk about feminism and thinking to myself at the young age of 18, well, I can't divorce my race from my gender. I can't look at things in that way. You know, she's talking about breaking down the patriarchy. And I'm like, well, can we break down these racial institutional systems as well? So the term intersectionality was coined by lawyer and civil rights advocate Kimberly Crenshaw more than 30 years ago. So we've been talking about this for 30 years. And she used this to describe how discrimination against different facets of a person's identity can overlap and impact their lives. And I'm going to quote her because I feel like this quote still resonates 30 years later. And she says, because the intersectional experience is greater than the sum of racism and sexism, any analysis that does not take intersectionality into account cannot sufficiently address the particular manner in which Black women are subordinated. So now we're going to launch this poll. This is my question to our audience and to is, can Black women experience gender bias in the workplace without their race playing a role in that bias? So we're going to give the audience about 30 seconds to answer this poll. Okay, that should be enough time. We can close the poll and see the results. Huh, that's interesting. So 41% say yes, you can, and 59% says no, you cannot. So our question for the panelists today is, what are your thoughts on the intersectionality of race and gender bias and how they overlap and reinforce each other? And I'm going to start with Ms. Deborah Martin Owens, because I know she has been biting at the chomp to discuss it.
I want to say that the views that I am about to share are my views, not the views of Sidley Austin, LLP. I forgot to say that in the beginning. I laughed because during the prep, this was probably the most, I think, heated conversation we had about this. And I will say that for me, the quote that comes in my mind besides Professor Crenshaw's quote is Zora Neale Hurston, when she said, the Black woman is the mule of the earth. And she said that in her book, Eyes Were Watching God, and that was written in 1937. So you're talking about 100 years. We are still in that position as far as I'm concerned. Black women hold up the world. We save democracy. We save the legal profession. We are doing the work of Jesus in this work. And I cannot separate my gender you know, when I don't have that luxury to say, well, this is a woman issue for me today, a Black issue today is here. For me, it's all Black. I think for me, when I walk into a space, they see Black first before they even see my gender. And we saw that with some of the crimes that have been committed against Black women in the last 100 years. When you are thinking about some of the work that Ida B. Wells has done, when they just lynched our Black men, they lynched Black women too. So it wasn't like they saw, well, that's a woman, we're not going to do that. For me, I don't separate the two, but I do see my Blackness is first and foremost, and then maybe my gender is second. I don't know how that sits with some people, but I am of a, you know, I thought about when Kimberly said, I'm in my 50s. And so for me, this is all that I know of, is that being Black is first and gender is second. And so when our white sisters are saying to us, you know, in the 1950s and 60s or 1920s and 40s about women's rights and women's you know, choice of the vote, about the patriarchy, we also have to talk about the matriarchy. We have to talk about both. And so for me, it has been an interesting conversation. And we know that Black women, especially in the 1920s, and I say this because I'm a chair of what was deemed a suffragettes organization 100 years ago. And I am the chair today, which is very interesting. And they talk about Black women not being involved in the way that they could have been involved in that movement. And I say that with our counterparts being Black men, we were surviving at the same time for the right for civil liberties. We weren't home taking care of children, and our men are out working and making all this money. We were also enslaved with our men. We were also struggling to be seen and not lynched with our men. And so for me, it's always been about race. I want to come one day and say it's about my gender when I walk in the room, but I don't ever think that's going to be in my lifetime in my 50s. I just don't see that. But I'm going to let you guys share your thoughts, and then I'll jump in after, because I know that this was what Tamika was waiting for. She was waiting for me, but I've tamed myself, Tamika, from our conversation.
You did, but what you said was, I mean, exactly what we were thinking. So now I think we're going to go to Kim on this issue to hear from her.
Sure, I concur with all that was shared. And, you know, when we talk about, I happen to be a member of Delta Sigma Theta, and we actually were back then very active in the suffragist movement. But when people say those kinds of things, I'm like, you know why you were out there marching? Because my grandmother and great-grandmother were watching your kids. So we didn't have the luxury of to me, I grew up feeling like feminism was a nice to have, a nice thing to think about. But right now I got to be Black and deal with all these other things. So I do believe that we can be impacted negatively by inequitable policies in the workplace that impact women because I'm a woman. But like Deborah, I really feel like it's very, very hard to separate the two. I don't know what I was watching recently, but the comment was made that white women were allowed to be pretty, and that was their compliment. The compliment for Black women was to be a strong Black woman. And there's nothing wrong with being strong, but maybe I want to be pretty and I want to be adored and I want to be cherished as well. And so what I think the intersectionality for us is it denies us a little bit of humanness and a little bit of womanhood. And I think all of that has to be taken into consideration when we are thinking about recruiting, and we're thinking about the retention, and we're thinking about a culture that is designed to keep those Black women in the room and at the conversation and in leadership roles. And I don't think that there's a whole lot being done about that. In DC here, a good friend of mine is the former president of the Women's Bar Association, and she was very, just talking about the fact that the percentage of African American women who are in senior leadership roles on in-house and senior leadership roles and roles at firms has stayed the same over the past 10 or 20 years. And we were talking about how we need to, so many of you know what the Mansfield Rule is. The Mansfield Rule talks about making sure that there is a specific percentage of diversity in filling certain roles. But what has happened when you look at Mansfield, many firms are able to satisfy that because they're satisfying it with white women. And what my girlfriend was aiming to do in DC was to create another rule that would focus specifically on success being where people of color were being considered for those roles, not just women or not just LBGT. But I'll tell you, it didn't get very far. We talked about it, we did some things, but here we are today, 3 years later, and I don't know that there's been a whole lot of advancement there. So in my role, I am looking to find ways to be very intentional about thinking about that intersectionality and thinking about making sure that we are not inadvertently disadvantaging African American women or women of color in the legal workplace. And let me just stop there because I know that there are some other comments. So let me stop there.
Sure. For this segment, we're also going to turn to Crystal to hear what she has to say on this issue.
Well, of course, I agree with my sisters, wholeheartedly with everything that they have said, is that it's so intertwined, you just can't separate the two, right? But I think that for us, there was a Harvard Business Review study done some years ago where it was a study about how ambitious women were from different backgrounds. And it showed how Black women were found to be at least 3 times as ambitious as white women. But even with that, less so to advance at the levels of white women. And I think that's because we still deal with the prove it again, bias, or the prove it again syndrome, which is, okay, you've already validated yourself, you've already proven yourself, but to us, you're still incompetent, you're still not ready, for this advancement opportunity. So that's what we're also having to, fight against. So that's all I wanted to add.
And Erica or Dina, do either of you want to add anything to this?
Sure, I'll jump in. And so I just challenge the whole premise that we should separate Black from gender, race from gender. Someone said it's always been about being Black. I agree. I practiced in Maryland. I was the second Black woman to become a partner in a major firm in the whole state of Maryland. I mean, that's just ridiculous. And, go down to DC and look at the Supreme Court. How many Black women are on the Supreme Court? None. So, we struggle. I recall a conversation as I was exiting, I was a full equity partner at my law firm, and I was told that I needed to apologize to one of the white men because they thought I had accused him of being a racist. And I said, well, first of all, if I had called you a racist, it would not be a question. And you're asking me to apologize for what I said or thought or what you thought I said. I said, I am genetically and constitutionally incapable of doing that. I am a Black woman. I was a Black woman long before I came to this law firm, and I'm gonna be a Black woman when I leave. And so for me, I feel like my race, I'm learning now about this term colorism. People looking at me thinking that I'm not Black. I'm as Black as anybody else. And I don't have to defend myself, but I will fight for myself, and I will fight for my right as a Black woman to be anywhere and to succeed in anything and to challenge and to compete. And it's because when people look at us, they think, oh, that's a Black woman. They don't think that's just a woman. We have a double barrier. It's doubly hard. And don't ever forget it. Don't ever forget it. And we make a mistake when we do forget that.
I don't
Eric,
think we
I-
can forget it.
Exactly
I don't
right.
think we can. I don't
Right.
think I don't think we can ever forget that we're Black first. I mean, we can be shot in our bed sleeping,
Right.
and we can be walking. We can never forget it.
We
I
should
just I echo everything. I don't know. I'm not sure how anyone could separate the two, right? And I think when that notion of not being able to forget it, and I believe it was Crystal who talked about the prove it again bias, and then also add in that the attribution bias is that often when Black women, if you show up late for a meeting, it's I hope that she doesn't have an issue with time management, right? So you've attributed something to the character, but another colleague shows up late and you've assumed maybe it's traffic. It must be the trains. It's something else, right? It's something external that's affected this person's ability to do X, Y, Z. But often as Black women, you are wondering, right, that notion of like overworking, feeling the need to be perfect because you're not going to get the things will be attributed to, I think, perceptions, stereotypes, biases that relate to Blackness.
But do you think that companies or law firms or organizations understand that you cannot divorce, thank you, the two from each other? Like, do they understand that as a concept? Or is this something that we just are going to have to continue to work on trying to get them to understand?
We have to continue to educate.
Yeah, I think there's education. And then also I'll say, I had a colleague, and I don't even remember who said this to me. There's also this notion of like ignorance as a resistance tool. Sometimes you understand a thing, but you just, well, tell me in a different way.
Yeah. The researchers' term for that is cognitive dissonance, where you know better, but you try to act like you don't.
Right.
Because the truth is too startling for you. And certainly throughout this evening, this has been a very robust conversation, and we have come away with many insights, many perspectives, and many solutions. And before we close out, there is a couple of questions in the Q&A that I want to present. But as I am sharing that, I want our panelists to think about, from a solutions perspective, if there was one thing that you could share with the women who are on this panel, who are participating today, or just anyone who is dealing with this issue of bias, what would that one thing be? So be thinking about that so that we can, of course, end with a focus on solutions to breaking the bias. But before we get to that, this is a very good question, and that is the elephant in the room of which is the anti-DEI person or the anti-DEI CEO, someone who is just really not committed at all, whether it's cognitive dissonance, racism, whatever, does not want this to be an issue at all. Would anyone like to comment on how to address it, whether that opposition is overt or covert? What do you do when you can't get leadership to support DE&I issues?
Real honest responses?
Yes.
Okay. If you do not have support at the leadership level,
Right.
What are we doing? Right? There's just really, right? You can support peers and colleagues and hope for a groundswell, but you're going to bump up against resources, lack of understanding. I've done a lot of coaching of like new DEI professionals that have run just into that brick wall. And the reason why I jumped up, I didn't even ask for permission to speak here, is because it is damaging, right? Emotionally, physically, when you're just running into a wall,
Mm-hmm.
I don't see room for growth in that. And I am a hopeful person, but if you're talking the top and you don't have a seat at that leadership table, and even if you have a seat at the table, you're fighting and they're giving no resources, I think it's time to take your expertise elsewhere.
Right. Yes, because sometimes you have to face the fact that this may not be the space where you can make the impact that you desire. So as we get ready to close out, I mean, this is certainly a conversation that can continue on, but we do have to bring our session to an end. And I'd like to hear from each of the panelists. We'll just kind of go in a round robin. Will you share your one thing that you can do either in your law firm or your workplace to really make an impact in breaking the bias? Crystal, we'll start with you, and I'll just kind of call you out because I see you in a different pattern on my screen. Crystal?
Yeah, so I have one answer with 4 parts, which I hope is allowed. And I call it the 4S bias interruption methodology. And the first thing is to show up, continue to show up as our authentic selves in spaces where we want to be, whether people want us there or not, regardless if anyone looks like us, and to continue to shine. The second thing is to evaluate our systems, right? To monitor and uncover any inequities that are present. The third S is to speak up when we observe and or experience inequities, whether that's for yourself or for others. And the last S is to just share stories and what we've talked about, information to continue to educate, reshape perceptions, and to break the bias.
Awesome, awesome. Kim, we'll hear from you.
Sure. I think the one thing that I would recommend would be increasing the number of women in leadership positions. I don't know the stat or even where this came from, but there's this concept that one woman in the room doesn't make a whole lot of a change, but 2 women in the room makes a world of difference. And so I think you have to have more women in the room to contribute to the conversations, to help question some of the policies. I'm a runner, and one of the things that I have been completely impressed with is Runner's World, which is a magazine that appeals to runners, has, after George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, has 180 degrees changed the way that they are talking about runners. So they put on the cover people who are people of color. They put on the cover people whose body shape and style and weight are very, very different. And what that has done is it helps people who don't look like a blonde woman with a ponytail consider that they can run and that they can be different, and that there's a welcomingness to that. That's what I need to change, what we need to change in our workplaces. Change the level of women that are in leadership so that they can inform the conversations and inform the solutions.
Thank you. Dana, what's your one thing?
Oh, okay. So I'm responsible for making Baltimore equity, and I'm starting with the 13,000 employees of Baltimore City. And it's a big job, and it's a good job, and it's challenging. So someone asked me this question earlier in the chat, and I'll just read what I wrote because I think it's the perfect response. My most enduring strategy is to speak up and challenge the biases I encounter, and doing so without judgment or retribution. I'm not here to make people feel guilty. I'm here to make people change. I try to invite colleagues into discussions so that there can be enlightenment and true learning about their biases. It's holding up a mirror, but not in a judgmental way. It seems to work almost all the time, and we have made a lot of progress, and there's a lot more to go.
All right, Erica.
My one thing would be to advocate for equity-centered policies and procedures, no matter what level. So any policy or procedure that affects the employee life cycle, right? So it's one thing that we often focus on the recruiting and the pipeline, and without the changes to policies and procedures, you're just pouring people into a gaping hole in the bottom of the floor. You're losing them if you haven't recentered what you do to ensure equity and inclusion.
And Deborah, we'll close it out with you.
Well, first, I want to echo everything that everyone has said, but I'm going to probably go off the beaten path like I normally do. I don't think bias will ever end. I think that we will probably be in our graves still fighting the fight of the last 400 to 500 years. I think what we have to do is figure out as a people, as women, as Black people, on how to thrive in the midst of all of this chaos, I would say. I think we need to think about what we can do to build our own structures.
Mhm.
Many of the places that we work at were built 100, 150, 200 years ago that never envisioned. I mean, if we went back to them, they would say the slaves are working where? And I think that we need to really think about the pie in the sky of this is all going to end. I don't believe in that. But I do believe that we can thrive. I believe this community that we're in today with all of the panelists and the attendees lets us go another day. Lets us to say, okay, I'm going to try another day to do the work that Crystal does, to do the work that Erica does, to do the work that Kimberly does and Dana does, to survive in this place, and then to bring other young people to come in and say, let me show you how I survived this. Because I started out in a big law firm, and now I'm here in another big law firm doing this work, what I call God's work. And so for me, it is not selling a story of like, this is gonna, I'm gonna teach you, train you, and I'm gonna get a few people, but for the most part, I'm gonna leave this world knowing that the next generation is going to be fighting this, even if we become the majority, as we see in South Africa and other parts of the world. And so for me, it's about thriving in this space. It's about being able to create a space where Black and Brown people can thrive no matter what, even in a place that didn't envision them.
Thank you so much. And I'll just say one last thing as I turn it over to Tamika, that Deborah, you are right. The research actually supports that we will always be inclined to have biases based on our social relationships. So it's a matter of focusing on how we manage that such that no one sector is having a bias work to their detriment. So with that, I thank you so much for allowing me to moderate this evening. We've had some really great conversation. I'm going to turn it over to my co-moderator, Tamika, and then we'll close it out with our host. So thank you so much. I've really appreciated it. Tamika?
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to moderate this discussion. It's been a wonderful and thought-provoking discussion tonight. As we said it earlier when we first began, we can't just talk about it, we have to be about it. So we must do something about this. We hope that tonight's program sparks some ideas for everyone on how we can break the bias. On behalf of the Women Lawyers Division and the Labor and Employment section, I would like to thank Erica and Kim and Deborah and Crystal and Dana, as well as my co-panelist, Stephanie, for joining us tonight. I'd also like to thank Stephanie and Valencia for creating and chairing the WLD International Committee. And lastly, but not least, I'd like to thank Sharon for her excellent leadership of the Women Lawyers Division. Without her, none of this is possible. So thank you so much, Sharon. And I wish everyone a good night tonight.
Good night.